Uh,
Yeah, enjoyable topic about the most unenjoyable thought imaginable.
Yeah, as we're breaking into this, I want to say to people ahead of time if they're wondering what this is all about. I'm opposed to killing people, so let's keep it simple.
Yeah, that's a simple ethic, I think. Well, we are live on YouTube now. Hello, everybody. It is Monday, March 16th. I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce. I'm speaking with Jennifer Friend, as usual. And today we have Alex Schadenberg with us from the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. Alex is the executive director and has been doing this work for several decades now. You said 1999, so that's like
Yeah.
27 years.
Yes, I used
A
to be
long
young.
time. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So I was thinking about that actually. That's a really you were talking about I listened to an interview you did. I had the opportunity to interview you. I think it was about a year ago. People can check that out. I'll link it in the description after I get everything uploaded. Um, but I was listening to another interview that you gave, and you were talking about suffering, and I want to get into that. But one of the things that causes, there's so many things that cause suffering, and even aging itself can be a process of suffering. And so if you start to go down this road of eliminating suffering, where does that ever end? And that's a huge question. And
Right.
but when you said I used to be young, I thought about that
So
myself
Leslie,
as I was listening to
the
that.
the audience that we're going to have today, do they come from all over, or is it primarily from a certain part of the U.S., or where's your audience coming from, Leslie, today?
All over, all over. I think mostly US. We have a lot of Canadians. Uh, thank you guys. James from Bahia is here. Mr. Morning Trek. Is that Mr. Morning Cigar? You changed your name. I love it. From Oregon, he says.
From
David
Oregon. Well,
LaBoy, student of rhythm. James from Bahia. Where are you guys located if you want to let us know? But we get people from like Spain and from just in European countries, Australia.
yeah.
Yeah.
England,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, but I'd say
Well, that's
mostly US.
so when we get
Oh,
questions, they
Brazil.
might come from all over the place. So that's very good. So I'm a Canadian, and in my work, I don't only deal with Canada, even though Canada's where euthanasia has become one of the craziest places in the world. But I also speak all over the US, and I've done a lot of speaking in England, Scotland, Ireland, those places, in the UK, especially now that they've had bills to try and legalize that are going through the system there. For instance, in Scotland, there's an assisted suicide bill being voted on March 17th. So I know when this is uploaded, I don't know if it's going to be uploaded immediately, but March
Yeah.
17th they're having their vote in Scotland on their assisted suicide bill, and it's been debated in England right now for it's the in Westminster, so that bill will be for both England and Wales, etc. So, this is the kind of issue that's going all over the place. But I talk about euthanasia and assisted suicide. So the first thing I'm going to do then, before we get into the basic questions, is define it so people know exactly what I'm talking about when I'm referring to it. You said someone here is from Oregon. So Oregon is the first place in the U.S. to have legalized assisted suicide, and it's been in Oregon for a very long time. Their uh, their law, they had a couple of referendums in the 90s, so their law came into place on January 1st, 1998 in Oregon. So that's a very long time ago, longer than I've been actually professionally involved in this issue. But euthanasia is when it's very similar to assisted suicide. So what happens is in euthanasia that a doctor, or in Canada, nurse practitioners can also do it. They will approve it, and then they directly cause the death. Usually they do it by hooking the person into an IV, and they use a plunger to have the lethal poison get into the system quickly. Whereas assisted suicide is the same idea, but in that case, the doctor, in some states now, nurses and physician assistants are able to be involved in it. They would then write the prescription for a very similar concoction, a lethal poison is what I would call it, and it comes in a powder format, and then you would mix it with your favorite drink of some sort. It's pretty awful to drink down though, which is obviously one of the things you see these videos. I don't want people to watch videos of people being killed by assisted suicide, but you're watching it and you realize they're saying that's the most awful thing. It's awful, but they mix it with their favorite drink and then they drink it down. So the difference between the two is how it's done. The intention's the same. The intention is to cause death. The outcome's the same. Outcome is death. Both cases require physicians to be directly involved. I do view assisted suicide as a form of suicide, but it's a little different because there's someone directly involved in the act, because you have doctors, nurses, etc., who are prescribing that lethal poison and who know the purpose of it and are not always, and actually usually not, but at certain times they're at the death. So you have this societal approval of giving people lethal poisons to die or to kill them by euthanasia, which is what's happening in Canada.
Mm. One of the things that really that I found very strange about all of this is that at the same time as we have governments offering death to people, offering to kill you if you're distressed about, I mean, now they're even doing it for mental illness. So,
Right. Yes. Yeah.
governments will offer to kill you, but we're supposed to be really concerned about people with suicidal ideation and go to great lengths to stop it. And so there seems to be a big conflict there. I mean, in the mental health training, they teach you that that's one of the very few reasons to violate patient confidentiality. If they have, if they're
Suicidal
suicidal,
ideation. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're
That's right.
you kind of screen them. And if you assess them to be suicidal, boom, you bring in the the law. You bring
Right.
in a bunch of force to bear. And yet in Canada, you can get suicide same day or you can be killed by the government same day if you ask for it.
All right. And that's accurate. I'm glad you said it that way, be killed, because in the case of euthanasia, it's actually the doctor doing the act. And further to it, or nurse practitioner, and further to it, we actually legalized it in Canada by creating an exception in the criminal code to homicide. So the Homicide Act, if you look, at our Homicide Act in Canada, I'm not a physician, I'm not a nurse practitioner, so I'm not allowed to kill you. But if I were, and there were two signatures on that sheet of paper saying yes, by other doctors and nurse practitioners saying yes, I could go ahead and kill you. Now, how it works in Canada is they have a two-track system. So if you have what they call an a, um, uh, well, that your natural death is reasonably foreseeable is how they say it. So it doesn't even make sense. Like, at least in Oregon with the suicide law, it says you have to have a 6-month prognosis, which of course is fraught with difficulties, but at least it's something that you can sort of put your hat on and say, well, you have to have a 6-month prognosis of terminal illness. In Canada, it says that you have to have that your natural death must be reasonably foreseeable, which means you have to have a terminal condition. But if you have that situation, then you can have a same day death. If you request it in the morning, it's possible to die that day. And we do have a large number of same day deaths if you consider the whole situation. We had a coroner's report come out of Ontario that only looked at the same day deaths. Well, it was same day or next day deaths, and it showed how quite a few of them were really problematic. But then we have a second tier, which is those people who aren't terminally ill at all. They have no terminal illness. What they have is a grievous and irremediable medical condition, which is not defined in the law. It's just not defined. Usually that means someone who has a long-term chronic condition, such as a disability, and someone's trying to call me and they're going to have to wait. But it means usually that they have a disability. And so the disability movement in Canada were very upset about that whole second tier group. That's how they said you could have euthanasia but not be terminally ill. Those people have a 90-day waiting period. So right now we have technically legalized euthanasia for mental illness in Canada. Now the law will not come into place until March 17th of 2027, but it did pass in Parliament. So it's just on this, waiting until they say they're ready for it, and they've determined March 17th, 2027 as the time when you can do euthanasia for mental illness alone, meaning that'd
Mm.
be the only sole condition. Right now, you can have euthanasia for mental illness in Canada, but you'd have to have another condition, a comorbidity, and then they can go ahead and kill you. So anyway, if you're not terminally ill in any way, you would have a 90-day waiting period. But those people tend to be people then with disabilities. So that's been a very controversial group because quite a few of them are people who are living in poverty. You've had quite a few cases of people saying, I can't live on the street, because people with disabilities often have no real significant income. They find themselves in a bad place, and they're asking for euthanasia not necessarily because they want it, but because they say, with my disability, I can't live on the street. There's just no way I can do this. And then you see them applying for euthanasia. We've had cases like that. People with um, uh, conditions such as autism. They're not actually sick. They're not actually in any way dying, but they are autistic and they've become very focused on death. So when you mention suicidal ideation, that's a primary issue because a lot of these people, their condition is then focused on the fact that they have suicidal ideation, but then they're being approved based on being in pain or suffering or having this long-term chronic condition such as multiple sclerosis or something, which may not be in any way terminal for them, but is certainly chronic.
Well, and when you talk about mental illness, the first thing that comes to my mind is I know in from being trained in diagnosis as a mental health counselor that everybody who walks through your door gets a diagnosis, every single person. So technically
Yeah,
anybody who comes in for any kind of mental health treatment is in some way diagnosably mentally ill, even if it's just an adjustment disorder. So you get something out of the DSM, or else you can't bill their insurance. So we're trained to bill to diagnose everybody. And
right.
so
Everyone has a
anybody
condition.
who
Yeah,
wants to be killed, anybody who just feels like whatever's on the other side of the door that I have to cross through, I don't think I can bear. Whatever that might be.
well,
It's divorce, it's
yeah,
an accident where they lost some ability in their body, maybe it's illness, whatever it is, maybe it's the death of somebody in their life that they're just
correct.
having severe grief over. But if they walk through the door and they say I don't want to live anymore, well, boom, you have a diagnosis, so you're mentally ill, so we
Yeah.
can kill you.
So a group of psychiatrists just published a paper just like a week ago on the growth of euthanasia for mental illness, for instance, in the Netherlands. So and they pointed out that the growth is significant. So when it started out that they were allowing euthanasia for mental illnesses, there weren't many of them. And then as time has gone on, it's become looser and looser and looser. So there is one doctor in particular who's become very well known for euthanasia for mental illness in the Netherlands. And last year he did a euthanasia on an 18-year-old, and that becomes really, no matter how you look at it, this is like, obviously I'm opposed to killing people, so I wouldn't ever think it's ever acceptable to be killing somebody by euthanasia. I believe in properly caring for them. I believe you never allow human beings to kill human beings because it just doesn't do well for us historically and in society over the long term when you give somebody else the right and law to kill you. But nonetheless, you start thinking about this, an 18-year-old killed by euthanasia who had mental health issues. They had their life before them, and how chronically ill are they, knowing that they're 18 and their brain hasn't fully developed yet? Like it starts becoming more and more ridiculous as the stories go on. But people say, but this is about their freedom. And that's the first thing I get into. I say, well, wait a second. The problem with euthanasia, it's not about freedom, it's not about choice, and it's not about autonomy. That's the lie from the other side. It's clearly not. And philosophically, we have to think about this. So when we're talking about euthanasia in particular, when the doctor injects you with lethal poison to kill you, and you're arguing this is about freedom, choice, and autonomy, well, it can't be when someone else is directly involved with killing you. You know what I'm saying? It's philosophically it doesn't fit. When someone else is directly killing you, you can't assume that this person is divorced from the intention of the person who's actually killing you. On top of it, they're doing the act. They're carrying it out. The biggest thing that comes to me at all is this: they say, oh, this is all about freedom of choice and autonomy, and then we talk about the problem of the role of the physician, because physicians have a very big sway over someone who's going through difficult times of their life. People will I know there's a lot of people on this call who might be very, how would you say, questioning of physicians all the time, and that's a good thing, actually, in a sense. But I mean, you can see how people are affected, and it's not even coercion then, but they're affected by that suggestibility at that time of their life. So you have these situations going on where someone says, "Yeah, I agree with you. In your situation, yes, this is the right decision." They're actually affirming death rather than trying to intervene and protect that life.
Yeah, I know from working with clients that often you'll hear somebody's story, and I know in my own life as well, there's times when whatever it is, whatever tangle you're in seems insurmountable. Like there's
Right.
no, how does this person get out of this issue? This is so bad, whatever this is. But then you watch these little miracles happen over and over
Yeah,
in your own life and other people's lives where somehow there's just some little shift and whole new possibilities open up and people go
uh,
on. And so
absolutely.
for somebody else to affirm, yeah, this case is absolutely hopeless and now there's no point, that that's just mad.
I think that's right. I think it's insane actually myself, but nonetheless, mad's a good word for it. Like for instance, if you look at the more recent case of Keanu, who on December 30th died in Vancouver at the hand of Dr. Ellen Wiebe. This is very upsetting. He was a man who had he's type 1 diabetic, so and he had been a diabetic, meaning insulin dependent, since the age of 4, meaning they had identified his diabetes when he was 4 years old. So he's had a lifeline of this, a life situation of having diabetes. But also that affected his eyesight. So yes, he was legally blind, but of course he wasn't completely blind in the sense that he couldn't see anything, but he was legally blind, meaning his eyesight was affected to the point where he was defined as legally blind. But really, he had suicidal ideation in a big way, and he had a lot of mental health issues. So his mother was absolutely shocked by it, and I did an interview with his mother. We put it up on my blog with a link to it, the whole thing properly. And what she kept on saying, but as much as he had diabetes, his blood sugar was well taken care of. As much as he had lost, most of his eyesight, he had fully adapted to that. People were shocked. They would say he doesn't act like he's a blind person, but his mental health issues, that was a different story. She said, he would go through deep, deep depression. And the problem is that she said every fall, when it came on and you had the shorter days, he would go into a seasonal affective disorder. And that's what happened again and again and again and again. So he died on December 30th in Vancouver. Now, here's the other thing about him. The doctors in Toronto who he had asked for euthanasia to approve him, they had said no, even though he was originally, okay, I'll give you further information. He was originally approved in 2022 for the same reasons in Ontario, but then after his mother got all upset and contacted the doctor and made a big deal about it, he changed his mind. But in in last year, he went to doctors in Ontario to get approved again, and they had said, no, you don't qualify. Your condition is not grievous. It's not irremediable. Yes, you have your blindness, etc., but that doesn't qualify you, etc., etc. So he went to Dr. Wiebe in Vancouver, who approved him and killed him. And you start thinking about this further, a 26-year-old man who might have had a better year next year or the year later, who was otherwise reasonably healthy. If you saw him, you'd say, oh, he looks pretty good, he looks very good. But nonetheless, he's dead now. Can't come back from death.
And I know legally blind people, they often have to wear really thick glasses. I mean, it's not great. It's too bad, but it's not, many people live good lives with visual impairments.
Absolutely. There's no reason why a visual impairment should be seen as a death sentence. For instance, a couple of years ago, we had the case in Calgary of the woman was 27 at the time. She was autistic and she was approved for euthanasia. And that's a case we got involved in, actually. We intervened in. It's a case that touched home for me. Now she's still alive today, thank God. But what happened is that she was approved for euthanasia based on she said she had pain. Okay, she claimed that she had significant physical pain, and she might very well have had pain, but essentially she was autistic, and that was it. Now, why this touched home to me so much is I have an autistic son who's about a year older than her, and he goes through very similar autistic realities, meaning there are times where he gets very deeply depressed. And the difficulty with autism is people become very then focused on it. So you have to, in his case, we find things to do, to go places with him, to do things with him, to try and remove him from that. But the father of this young woman, first of all, she was living at home. So you may think, okay. But the father of this young woman, he went to court and he prevented that death because he argued, my daughter does not have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. She's autistic, but she has no medical condition. If you actually examine her medical records, there is nothing there in any way that you could approve her for. But of course, she's autistic and she's become focused on wanting to die. And that was exactly her case. She was focused on wanting to die. If you talk to Keanu's mother, she says exactly the same thing. The problem with Keanu is he became hyper focused on wanting to die.
Mm.
And he would talk about this. This was his goal. And so in this case, of course, Dr. Weeb killed him. But I mean, in the case of the young woman in Calgary, she's still alive, and that's actually wonderful that she's still alive because you can't turn your life around when you're dead. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way.
Well, and I think that research shows that there's something contagious about suicide, and that's one of the reasons why um,
Yeah.
there's been some journalistic controversy about reporting suicide deaths, for instance. I remember there was uh, a, a big bunch of reporting done that after the movie Heathers, do you guys remember that?
Yeah.
That
Yeah. But
there was a spate of suicides, and that after a suicide is reported, there's a bunch of people who get the idea and start copycatting. So I wonder how many people become obsessed with this because it's made so common right now and so easily accessible, and there's so much reporting about it.
yeah, and in the way they report it too becomes a secondary problem because when there's journalistic guidelines for reporting a suicide. They're supposed to include the suicide hotline information as well as they're supposed to intentionally not in any way glorify that death. You're supposed to make it very clear this was a sad suicide death, that sort of thing. And it's not only in these movies because, we see this actually just let's say a famous actor dies by suicide, you will see some copycat suicides in the culture of how that person died. So when they're reporting that suicide death, the journalistic guidelines tell you not to describe the suicide, how it happened. And when they do that, then you'll see these copycat suicides happen. So, for instance, even my own experience, I live in a small town in just south of London, Ontario, in southern Ontario. And a few years ago, now this has been actually maybe 15 years ago now, there was a young high school student who died by suicide. And what happened is two more young men also died by suicide in that small town within the next couple months. So you see how that copycat suicide problem is very much part of the human nature situation where people going through a difficult situation. It's almost like the one death gives you permission for another death. And so
Mhm.
we have to be very careful with that. But with euthanasia, they're always glorifying it. They're saying, oh, the so and so is really suffering. And isn't it wonderful that they had relief from their suffering? And this is how they'll talk. Or they make it sound like this was the most wonderful thing to do.
Mhm.
And then, of course, you get this whole situation of the brainwashing effect. And so I believe that's what happened in Canada. Because in
Mhm.
2015, we had the Carter decision at the Supreme Court, which led to us legalizing euthanasia in 2016. So it was the Carter Supreme Court decision. But as that case was, coming to a completion, we had between 2014 and 2015 and early 2016 in Canada, we were inundated with stories by not just one media outlet, but by multiple media outlets. We're inundated with stories about people who had terminal conditions or significant chronic conditions and how euthanasia was the answer to their condition. So when you're getting this over and over and over again, you're conditioning people to believe that they only have two choices. They have one choice, which is called euthanasia or assisted suicide, and you have a second choice, which is natural death, but they're saying you're going to suffer so greatly by natural death. Really, the first choice is the option. And of course, the argument is false. It's completely false. But that's not the point. They're glorifying death by euthanasia or assisted suicide, and then they'll often refer to as someone who's being, you know, they were so strong as to choose this. It's like, what makes you strong to be killed? What makes you strong in the fact that you were killed? I'm not saying you weren't going through a difficult condition, and I'm not saying they didn't want to die. I'm saying, though, what does that make them strong for? It's the
Yeah.
sales approach, just the constant selling of it. Now, in
Yeah.
Canada, we've gone crazy with this. Like we're now, our 2024 data, we don't have the 2025 data yet. I have made predictions about 2025 because I do have the Ontario data, and Ontario represents 39% of Canada's population. So I do have that data. So I am projecting about a 7% increase in Canada in 2025, which would put us somewhere in the 17,600 rate for that year. But anyway, in 2024, we had 5.1% of all deaths were euthanasia. 5.1%. Then that's pretty massive. But Quebec is 7.9% of all deaths. So that makes Quebec, as a jurisdiction, the highest euthanasia rate in the world. And I think what's really happened is this whole contagion effect has gone wild, but also the fact that the law lacks any definition. I mean, there really isn't, like when we talk about having and I started that in the beginning, like in Canada, you need to have an irremediable medical condition in order to be approved for that track one, which could be a same-day death. But it's not defined. So that means you have to have a type of a terminal condition. But what does that mean? There are a
Mhm.
lot of people who have a type of a terminal condition. I mean,
Mhm.
and the other thing is, of course, you don't have to accept treatment. So it's not about, am I terminal or can I receive treatment? It is, if I decide not to have treatment, that would make me terminal. Therefore, I now qualify and I can have a same-day death. And that's what you have, which really makes things go crazy. On top of it, the law lacks any way, how would you say, oversight. I mean,
Mhm.
once two people have signed off, they can go ahead and kill you. And there's no way to suggest they can't. The law is completely oriented towards they can go ahead and kill you. So in the case of the girl in Calgary, the dad took the case to court. The judge actually decided on the side of yes, she can have euthanasia. The reason it didn't happen is because in his judgment, he really questioned the role of Alberta Health Services in her approval because Alberta Health Services directly got involved with getting that approval. And he questioned that. He made it very clear that the role of Alberta Health Services was very problematic in this case, which of course threw a cold blanket over the whole situation. And they removed her approval, and said you're going to have to qualify again.
Mhm.
So you know how these things go. So
Oh, Jennifer, you're muted there. Yeah.
What would you say about more, I don't know, what I think of as sort of extreme cases, like somebody who has glioblastoma and has an estimated 6 months more to live and is in horrible pain and their death is unavoidable and they'd like to skip over the suffering part and, die peacefully surrounded by family, friends, which is the usual
right.
argument. What would you say, like what would your ethical objection be to assisting a person in that situation?
Well, I actually have 2 points to make. The first is that it is that hard case which leads to legalizing because, of course, nobody wants to go through that. I don't want to suffer. And I don't want you to suffer. I don't even want Leslie to suffer. I've got no interest in any of you suffering. So, right off the bat, we all agree that our heart should go out to that situation and we should do whatever possible to keep that person comfortable. But there's a whole nother question now, first of all, in going to the next step, we're saying it's okay to kill that person because what you're actually asking is that now you're going to ask your medical professionals to be involved with killing somebody, and can you actually now control that? And even in the state of Oregon, we have someone here from Oregon where they've had assisted suicide for a very long time. I can go through some of the data with you if you want me to. They don't really control the law. If you look at it, there is no clear oversight of the law. There is a significant number of assisted suicide approvals every year where they have no idea what happened to these people. The second thing is if you're going to approve it for that reason, as an example, well, why wouldn't you then approve it for the person going through significant mental health issues? Because while you're saying you're approving this, is you might say they're terminally ill, so I'll give that a pass. Well, actually, we're not giving it a pass because of terminal illness. It's because of our fear of suffering. But I'm not questioning that people with mental health issues aren't suffering,
Mhm.
right? And the other thing is, if you're going to approve it for that reason, why wouldn't you approve it for people with chronic conditions who aren't dying at all? Because a lot of these people with chronic conditions, so let's say someone has serious back, like a serious back injury. Now, there's lots of things we can do to help them with their serious back injury. There's no question about it. But they're always going to have a significant level or a certain level of pain, no matter what we do. Like even with an excellent pain pump and the proper care and certain exercise regimens and everything, there's always going to be a level of suffering there. We know that. There's no argument there that that's going to happen. It's part of the human condition. I have a physical body, and I know that's going to be the reality, but I might not be terminally ill in any way. So should we not then approve it for them too? And once you say it's okay to kill, the problem with the argument is, okay, then why can't I then kill this other person? If I can kill them with glioblastoma, well, why not this other condition? And there's lots of terminal conditions that aren't in any way I'm serious about this when I say this, they actually lead to comfortable deaths. There's lots of medical conditions like that, sometimes what causes the difficult death is the fact that they've gone through so much medical treatment that they've experienced this breakdown in their tissue and their body so much that they start getting what you call this type of a nerve pain because their whole system has been broken down by the excessive amount of treatment they've received. And when they didn't recover, because you're, of course, receiving that treatment, hoping to recover. When they didn't recover, now they have a really broken down physical situation. And that is true. But a lot of conditions are not. Most people do not have painful deaths. You talk to any good palliative care doctor, nurse who's actually done their job well, they'll say there's very, 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 very few conditions that we can't care for. Very few.
I actually
Very,
had
very few.
a good friend who died from glioblastoma. And I believe his death was hastened by his doctor and his wife through administration of lots of pain medication, lots of morphine that lowered his respiration. And that is like, I think there's a blurry line there between palliative care and care that will end the life. But
Okay.
if it's done it seems like there's an ethical difference if you're doing it in order to relieve pain, not in order to cause death.
Right. Well, clearly there's also protocols that should be followed. So if someone is experiencing pain, I've got no interest in them suffering like that. So obviously speaking, there should be like a regular interval of increase of the medications until they're comfortable. And so you're not intending in any way to cause their death, but they might then die. That's true. They might die, but it's not the intention. So there's a clear difference between one's intention to kill and one's intention not to kill.
Interesting.
And you follow a protocol. Now, the problem with the protocols is sometimes the protocol is intentionally abused. So, for instance, let's be honest, I have no morphine in my body, none. Okay, I have no medical condition right now that I would need morphine for to treat pain and suffering, etc. I have none in my body. Therefore, if you were to give me a small amount of morphine, it'd probably have a massive effect because my body's not developed any tolerance to it. And that's the whole thing about drugs like morphine and things like that. Your body develops a tolerance to it. So even when you're at a higher level of drug in order to keep you comfortable, that might not kill you because you've developed a tolerance to it as long as we've increased the doses. But the problem with that is that I have to continue to increase the doses in order to keep you comfortable because your body continues to develop a tolerance to it. And this is a reality. So, but there's a clear difference between killing somebody and intentionally doing so, or that they might have died because of the amount of drug we gave them because we were trying to kill their pain. There's a clear difference. And you can see the difference in just how they jumped the drug. So someone goes into palliative care and they die the next day, and the doctor went from this amount to this amount to that amount. Boom. Well, obviously speaking, the question is what was the intention? Because the intention would have never justified that act, right?
I want to read a couple of chats here. Jennifer, you want to say something first?
Yeah, I started thinking as you were speaking about what you mentioned earlier about cases where there's people that are quite severely disabled and lacking financial resources and end up living on the streets, which living on the streets sounds extremely difficult to me, let alone with a major illness or disability.
Right.
Do you worry at all that, um, the national health system could be more tempted to offer people in that condition assisted suicide or euthanasia because they're a drain on their system, and it's sort of easier to do that than to figure out how to house these people and give them wraparound services that they would need to want to stay alive?
So the problem in Canada right off the bat, as you talked about, you mentioned wraparound services, and a lot of people need that, but they can't get it. They literally can't get that. Now, so the other issue with disability is the issue of poverty because the amount of money they're receiving from the government. If you consider the cost of in any major city in Canada for the cost of just a rental unit, they don't receive enough money to cover that. So you have a problem right off the bat that they need to have subsidized housing. Then the next question is, well, how do you qualify for subsidized housing? So it becomes a whole problem, one after another, after another, after another. So we had the case of the guy in St. Catharines who had a subsidized housing unit. He's a disabled guy, and he ended up being told by the owner of the building, you have to leave because we're going to update the building. We're going to redo this building. Now, the problem with the subsidized housing system is that if you leave your subsidized apartment, then you go back to the bottom of the list. You have to
That's right.
requalify for subsidized housing for your next apartment. So there was no apartment that he could afford. There was nowhere he could live. This was a guy in St. Catharines. There was nowhere. He could not find an apartment anywhere in that region that he could afford to rent. So now he's going to be out on his own on the street. So he goes to his doctor and he requests MAID, euthanasia. He says that, and he qualified based on his disability, but he made it very clear to his doctor, I'm not actually interested in euthanasia at all. I just know I cannot, with my disability, live on the street. I cannot, it's not possible for me to tolerate that. But the doctor approved him anyway based on his disability. What ended up happening is a news agency found out about his case. A reporter found out about his case. It hit the news. It became really big, and then somebody started a GoFundMe page for him. They raised about $60,000 for him, and of course, that found him a place to live, and he was happy to be alive. But remember, here's a guy who's and he made it very clear to the media. I told my doctor I'm not wanting euthanasia, but I'm applying for it based on the fact that I cannot live on the street. I can't do that.
So
And
in
this is
that
the kind
case,
of
you'd
thing.
really be euthanizing the person to avoid human misery, which is very
Well, he
different,
was
right?
being approved based on his disability. He had a significant back disability, so it prevented him the ability to work in any meaningful way because he has a significant back disability. We had the case of the woman with multiple chemical sensitivities who lived in Toronto, and she was living in a social housing unit. So her life was unbearable, and she applied and received and she was approved for euthanasia. But remember, living in a social housing unit with multiple chemical sensitivities in the extreme sense is not the place to live. You cannot imagine having multiple reactions to cleaning fluids, people doing pot, whatever it might be. And she made it very clear in her request for euthanasia that she couldn't even leave her bedroom. It was so bad because as soon as you could start smelling and her reactions were so extreme to that. But she didn't need death. She needed a proper place to live. Now, I know this might not be easy, because especially if you consider the cost of living in Toronto. Like, Lord have mercy. Like, can you imagine the cost of living in Toronto and then having MCS in an extreme way? What she needed was actually to leave Toronto. I live in a small town. She probably could have afforded to have her own house and rental by government, arrangement in our town because it's not so expensive there. It was probably doable, but in Toronto it wasn't doable. So she ended up dying by euthanasia. But you start thinking these things through, and you're realizing, how did this woman get approved? And really, what she needed was a proper place to live. How do you define irremediability when, in fact, what she needed was a proper place to live?
Wow.
But those are just a couple of the stories.
That strikes me as really tragic, and it also kind of strikes me as like, well, we can't solve this problem, and this is this is sort of like a cheaper, more expedient solution to what is in some ways an actual housing problem.
Right. So you earlier asked me the question about, glioblastoma, which is, of course, a terrible condition to have in many senses, because it is very likely to be terminal, and if it does, the tumors continue to grow, etc. But Canada, sometime in mid to late April, will hit 100,000 euthanasia deaths since legalization. So, the difficulty is that we can talk about glioblastoma or cancer or these kind of conditions to say, at least in those cases, we should legalize euthanasia. And I don't believe in killing people. So obviously, I don't believe in giving the right of law to doctors to kill you. So obviously, I think that that's a very bad idea. And I start thinking about human history and what's happened in the past and where we're going right now. And I consider this all really a bad road to go down. It's pretty insane considering the human condition. But nonetheless,
Well, what do you
There,
imagine could happen if you carried it to if
what
you carried
exactly
that
what we
idea
have?
through to its worst imaginings? Where do you imagine it going?
Well, we're not very far from it right now in Canada. We're very close. And especially since some doctors are already sort of like that. Some of the MAID doctors in Canada are basically approving basically anybody who's requesting death. Like if you start looking at the Dr. Ellen Wiebe, for instance, some of her more egregious cases, you start saying to yourself, well, how did she approve that person? So, for instance, last year there was a court case that prevented one of the approvals. She had an approval for someone, and the woman's common law husband went to the court and said, my common law wife, she has no grievous and irremediable medical condition. She doesn't. She wants death. She has this medical condition, but she's fully treatable. She's fully treatable. And the judge agreed and granted an injunction. But you see, it didn't matter to Dr. Wiebe. What mattered to Dr. Wiebe is you have a request. She looked at the condition. She says, well, that could fit the criteria of the law. And she approved it with another doctor signing off. Now, the other thing about doctors like Dr. Wiebe and a few others like them, there's quite a few of them like that in Canada. What it is in Canada is you've got this small number of doctors that do a huge number of deaths. And then you've got a bunch of other doctors who've done a few. That's what you have. So you got these massive numbers of euthanasia deaths by several doctors. And they always then have a whole system where they're approving and then there's a second doctor always signing off. It's just a friendly situation where there's this constant situation like that. But when you start looking at it, you start realizing, where have we gone in Canada? Because you're getting some pretty crazy situations. So for instance, the Ontario coroner. In Ontario, when there's been a death by euthanasia, the doctors have to send in the report to the chief coroner of Ontario. That's how it works. So now remember, this is an after the death report being sent in. It's not a pre-death approval system. So anyway, the coroner was looking at this and they put out several reports. They've put out, I think, 6, maybe 7 reports now out of the Ontario coroner's office. The very first report showed that between 2018 and 2023, there was about 428 deaths in Ontario alone by euthanasia, which were outside the criteria of the law. 428. That's significant. That's very significant. But obviously that's a small number of the total deaths. But then you start looking at the cases, and you realize some of these cases made no sense at all. And this is right out of the coroner's report. So this is not a Schadenberg report. This is out of the Ontario chief coroner, their report. The one case that was really crazy was a guy who had a post-COVID vaccine syndrome. They even put that in the report. Now, I'm not sure if other doctors would have agreed with that diagnosis. But anyway, this is someone who died by euthanasia. But what happened is after his third shot, he started having fibromyalgia type symptoms. And he went to multiple doctors. He went to several psychiatrists. He was even actually, because he was going through such suicidal ideation, he was twice signed in. The first time he signed into a psychiatric hospital, he did on his own. The second time, he was put in without his consent, but he was having certain painful issues. That's correct. But in all the doctors he saw, all the specialists he saw, they found no medical condition. I'm not saying he didn't have pain and symptoms. They found nothing. But he was approved for euthanasia. He died by euthanasia. They did an autopsy on him, which is also rare. Autopsies after euthanasia almost never happen. They did an autopsy on him, and in the autopsy report, it says they found nothing wrong with him. There was nothing, they could find nothing wrong with him. So I'm not saying he wasn't going through difficult situations. They also said that he had a long-term psychiatric history. So I'm not sure if that contributed or not. I wouldn't know. I'm not a doctor. But in the coroner's report, it pointed out that he had this long-term history of psychiatric conditions, suicidal ideation. He had they had a whole description of his psychiatric issues that he had, etc. And of course, these reports come out not naming who he is, so we have no idea who he is, etc., or who he was. But this is the kind of thing you get, and you start looking at this thinking, okay, well, no one's questioning that he claiming to have pain, etc. And he might very well have had pain, but he had no medical condition. There was nothing there. Could he have gotten better in the future? Well, I don't know. I can't say if he could have gotten better in the future because he's dead. Right?
Yeah, that's an incredible example. I'm going to read a couple of these chats that we have in here from people. This is a pretty lively chat right now. James from Bahia, another light one, about this topic. Mr. Morning Trek says this channel is a masterclass learning deeply about a new topic each week. Thank you. I think that the medical ethics, bioethics, this is a really important topic to me. I think that there's been two major ideological changes or phenomena that have happened over the last 10 years that have greatly impacted my life and my perception of what's going on in the culture. And that's what we've seen with the sort of I don't know, how do you sum it up? Woke Marxism, this kind of thing that's swept through, and the increase in medical authoritarianism. And so these are the two main issues that I find very interesting. And the counseling field is at the intersection of both of those, in that it's pseudo-medical with this whole clinician training in this medical mindset. And it's also a great enforcer of the woke stuff and a vector for the education of that. So that's why, if anybody's wondering where these things connect and why this channel kind of touches on both of those, that's what the reason for that. There's a bunch of really good stuff in here. Student of Rhythm, there is a definite lack of consistency. Caring about suicidal ideation is at least lip service to rejecting the logic. Yeah, so if the government cares about you being suicidal, why is also the government offering you death? Student of Rhythm also says the logic is, if my life is a net liability, I should be eliminated. That's one of the things that I wonder, if you have somebody else in charge of assessing your suffering, at some point, if you want to avoid suffering, just avoid living. And so that there's a slippery slope there.
The problem with the issue of suffering is there's nothing you can actually assess it by.
It's subjective.
Yeah, it's 100% subjective, because all of the suffering is based on the fact that I am saying I'm suffering. And well, I don't know what's going on inside your body. I have no idea. So when we're talking about suffering, there's nothing objective about it. So now you have something that's completely outside of any objective criteria that now we're going to determine this by. But then the other question is, once you say it's okay to kill, well, now it's essentially based on suffering. You might have other conditions, etc., that we might be pointing to say they qualify because they have A, B, or C, or whatever it might be. But essentially it's because of suffering, because why would we approve to kill you? Because it is killing. People want to forget this. They want to think it's all about, I chose this, it's my act, and da-da-da. But when the doctor comes and puts an IV into your system, or the nurse puts the IV in your system, and then the doctor plunges in this lethal poison, they're doing an act to you. So they're not only saying, I agree, your life's not worth living. They're saying, I will kill you. I will kill you. That's, to me, very serious. That's a very serious thing. And now you're saying we can control it. Remember, none of these laws require, none of them in the world require a pre-approval process, which has got, how would you say, a third-party independent unit looking at it. Even if that were the case, I wouldn't be in favor of killing. Like, I don't believe it's good to kill. But nonetheless, at least then you would say, oh, the criteria was met. I can't say the criteria was met in Canada because the system is a system that happens behind a closed door. Once the signatures are on the paper, they have the legal right to kill you, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. And I mean that literally. And there's no way to sue them in a bad situation either, because the law says that the doctor or nurse practitioner only has to be of the opinion. Yeah. The law says they only have to be of the opinion that you fit the criteria of the law. So even in an egregious case, like Keanu's case, the parents are trying to figure out some way to gain justice for what happened to the death of their son. And they're looking at it, and in this case, Keanu's stepfather is a very active and successful lawyer. They're like, the law is pretty much set that we can't do anything.
Wow. So there's no redress for a bad death.
And even in Oregon, where you have assisted suicide, they have the good faith principle. Well, the good faith principle means I did so in good faith. Well, under the good faith principle, it's impossible to sue someone, because you can't say they didn't have they didn't do this in good faith. They didn't do this with the intention of following. You can't say that if it's only a good faith principle. So they did that on purpose, where the laws were written in such a way to
It's
give
subjective
total
too.
legal cover to the person who's willing to kill.
Mr. Morning Trek says, 10 years ago when I lived in an apartment, my neighbor asked to have a beer with me. I didn't feel comfortable. She hung herself a couple of hours later. I'm so sorry. That is really, that's a horrible thing to have to
That is very
know. And
yeah.
And then
Well,
Rob Bear 8806. Thank you for the super chat, Rob. He says, I'm autistic in that I don't have the capability to communicate using nonverbal modes such as tone of voice and facial microexpressions. Thus, I'm incapable of being what academia calls emotionally intelligent. And I think that was when you were speaking of the
well, my
it,
son Pete would be very similar to that. I would disagree on his self-assessment of not being emotionally intelligent. Obviously his experience is different than someone who's not autistic. There's no question about it. But I don't find autistic people to lack emotional intelligence, but their experience of how they experience the stimuli around them is very different. That's correct. How their brain processes is different. But I do find them emotionally intelligent, just in a different way. So
There were a
I
couple
wouldn't
of
say
good
he's not.
questions in here. Brian Lewis, I was looking for your comment. He asked about how this relates to the issue of organ donation. And I wanted to, he says, is there any evidence that this is being encouraged for the purpose of organ harvesting? And I just spoke with an anesthesiologist about the ethics of organ donation the other day. So if you guys haven't watched that conversation, please check that out, because she's got a wonderful wealth of information about all of the bioethics and the process of organ donation. But I wanted to ask you about that, Alex, and also about other financial incentives in this process of euthanasia.
So the answer of organ donation is yes. Now, of course, to qualify for organ donation, you need to have healthy organs. So people who are actually terminally ill, and there's a huge number of people who are going to die by euthanasia who are actually terminally ill, they usually would not be considered as organ donors because they have to have healthy organs, right? So that's just a reality. But these other people, especially people with disabilities who are not terminally ill, or people with mental health issues who are not terminally ill in any way, many of them have very healthy organs. So they're being encouraged to become organ donors along with this euthanasia. So in my own province, if you have a situation where you're being approved based on a grievous and irremediable medical condition, but you're not terminally ill, they do then say to that person, have you considered organ donation? And if they're possibly interested, they're connected to this Trillium gift of life, which is the organ donation whole thing, and they're approached about organ donation. So obviously speaking, it is interconnected. Now, the issue of money is a whole other issue, because it saves Canada billions of dollars, euthanasia. So I said that by mid-April, late April, we'll be hitting 100,000 deaths since legalization, which was 2016. You have to think that those aren't just healthcare savings, which is one thing. Obviously, dead people do not cost healthcare dollars. And there's a lot of which is people out there might think that's a good thing, saving us money in our healthcare system, especially with the backlogs and problems with our healthcare system. And with universal healthcare, it's a serious problem, the money in the system. But secondly, there is the whole thing about social services. So the prime example, the one with MCS, she was 51 years old when she died. Keanu was 26. Keanu was 26. So Keanu was collecting a disability benefit for his health situation. He might have lived 60 more years, 50 more years. Who knows? I don't know. Might have lived more than 60 years. But you see, dead people don't collect disability allowances or disability pensions. What about those people who die early because they decided that they wanted euthanasia, but let's say they're 62 years old or 63 years old. They never collected a pension then. Most pensions start to be collected around 65. You can delay it or whatever. But I mean, dead people don't collect pensions. They don't collect social service money. They don't cost you healthcare dollars. It saves billions of dollars. The woman who was 51, as I say, she also was on a disability benefit. If the guy in St. Catharines had died, his name was Amir Farsu. If he had died by euthanasia, rather than having a GoFundMe page raise the money to find him an apartment, how much money would that have saved? Because obviously he can't with his back disability, he doesn't have gainful employment. It'd be very difficult for him to have gainful employment because he is in pain. He
Well,
doesn't
this
want to
raises
die,
some really
so
difficult questions about welfare, about how much, like Student of Rhythm says, human needs are expensive. What right do I have to be a burden? But at what point
well, I don't
are
consider
people
humans
more
burdens.
capable of solving their problems? And at what point are it with welfare? And I know that we might not have time to really get into this question because it's rather complex, but if you set up a system where people depend on governments rather than on their families, we've become so disparate, so disconnected. And if you set up a
Yeah,
welfare system where it's the state that's going to meet your needs, at some point it's kind of, there's that subjectivity there of need as well. Like people can, now we see with young people, and I know
yeah.
personally cases like this where young people cut off their parents because they don't affirm a trans identity or some other aspect of the kid's life.
I'm not
And
getting
then the
into that issue.
kid, I know, well, that's fine. But it's the rate of family cutoff is really high right now. We see a lot of
Yeah.
people turning their backs on their families, and I have thoughts about that too, which we could get into sometime. But the parental alienation and just that cutoff, that estrangement that's happening. But the kid can leave a relatively well-to-do family and then go get social services because now they're an individual on their own. If those services were not there for them to qualify for, they'd have to rely on the resources that they have
Right.
back home. So you've
So
got all these systems where the state steps in, and at some
Mhm.
point, people become exhausted in their ability to have compassion for the needy. And then you
Yeah,
start to have this callousness where there's this cynicism, and yeah, they're just a burden on everybody else. And people start to become callous to the idea of killing people instead of supporting them.
well, I do think that is part of the human nature problem that you think that humans wouldn't do this to someone, and yet if you've become any student of history, you start realizing that throughout history, and not even in the far back history, in the very recent history, and around us, even right now in the world, there are places where things are happening that are absolutely terrible, where humans are doing things to humans. And you start thinking about that, and you start realizing, should I ever give that power over to someone else to have the right to kill me? No. Now, as it goes to social services, I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, when we're talking about a person with a disability who literally does need the help of the state, there's nothing new about that historically. In the past, these people often might have had to be beggars, or they might have died young because they didn't have the services they need. And in a truly caring society, you have to care for people with disabilities, as well as when someone becomes very elderly. At a certain point, having a social service system that takes that into account is not a terrible thing, because at a certain point, either you have family caring for you, or someone's got to do it because because of your age. Now, people do retire fairly healthy today, but you know what I'm getting to. At a certain point, you do need help. There's no question about it.
Yeah,
Or you might be independently wealthy and you don't need help. So that could be a totally different situation. But I don't think with disabilities we should ever consider them to be a burden, because of the fact that I look at my own son who's autistic. You can say what you want, but it's very hard for him to get a job. The way,
right.
and it's not like you can't communicate with him. It's not like he doesn't do things. It's not like he isn't part of society. He's completely part of society, but it's very hard to find him employment. And
Yeah,
maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe the government should do another direction and say, this is how we're going to try and help ensure employment for certain people who are very difficult to get employment for, not because they wouldn't want to work, but because they have a disability which makes it difficult for them. And then we find a way for them to more easily find work. Maybe the government subsidizes it or something. But without work, what are you going to
yeah,
do? Like,
yeah.
honestly, what are you going to do? And for a lot of people, it's not that they don't want to work. They
It's
might be
that
in a
they
situation
can't.
where it's very difficult to work. That's right. So
Just a couple more
it's a catch
comments
22.
before we wrap up, because I think people are engaging with this particular idea in an interesting way. Mr. Morning Trek says it's to be poor and using government support, it's a dangerous place. Student of Rhythm says Alex doesn't see humans as burdens because he's a moral man. He's not a government bureaucracy or a corporation. And David LeBoy says, I seem to remember certain people saying that welfare could create these kinds of disasters. I'm sure I'm just misremembering being a conspiracy theorist and all. And yeah, so there's some more. Oh, student of rhythm also says people are naturally callous about the lives of anybody, quote, outside their tribe.
Yep.
And yeah, there's so much more to say, and we've got another
Well,
hour to chat about this particular issue off the record.
yeah.
We're
But
gonna
as we're wrapping up, I just want to say
yeah.
that a lot of people in their mind can easily justify euthanasia or assisted suicide for those extreme cases that we were talking about earlier. And and you if you don't feel that way in a sense, you don't have a heart. So I understand as we have a heart that goes out to people going through difficult situations, and I don't have any interest in you suffering. But once you start killing people, which is what we're doing now in Canada, with 13 states in the US that have legalized assisted suicide. You've got countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Spain, etc. has now got euthanasia. Once you start killing people, now how are you going to limit this? Okay, now honestly speaking, in the human dimension, how can you actually limit it?
Mhm.
You can't. In the short term, you could say, oh, it's only going to be for A, B, and C, but that's unjust. So, for instance, in Canada, we extended it to mental illness. Why? They said it was discrimination. So when they were debating it now, I mean, it comes into place on March 17th, 2027, but that's mental illness alone. That would be your only condition. But I mean, they said it was discrimination not to allow it because of the suffering involved with mental illness. Well, if you're allowing killing, that argument is sadly correct. But I
Mhm.
would say we should have never gone there in the first place. You open the door. Yeah, you're right. That's true. And what about children?
Mhm.
Why shouldn't we kill children then?
Mhm.
Like that's a big issue going on in Canada now, that the whole debate around euthanasia of children. And
Yeah.
you would say, why are we going there? Because the fact of it is why would it only be adults that you can kill? Why is that? Do children not suffer also?
Well, there's so many implications of this and so many more questions to ask and to
Why not
discuss.
newborns?
Yeah.
I know it's all eugenic. I think
Mhm.
all of this is eugenic actually. That's a whole other talking point. What is eugenics? What's happened in the modern age? This whole concept of the life not worth living?
Well,
What's happened?
Alex, if you want to come back on in say a month or so, we could get into some of those issues too. I'd love to have those
Yeah.
conversations with you.
As long as those people watching want to join, I'm here.
Yeah. Tell people where they can find you, Alex.
Yeah, it's epcc.ca, Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, epcc.ca. But the best place is to go to my blog, which is epcblog.org. And we have a film out now. It's called Life Worth Living. And it's a very powerful film, and you'll find it at lifeworthlivingfilm.com. Lifeworthlivingfilm.com, one word.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll put all those links in the description after I get this video updated in a little while here. And if anybody out there, if you're not part of our peer discussion and support groups, you're welcome to join us. We are going to continue the chat with Alex off the record here. And thank you so much for joining us on the live stream. If you want more information about Solid Ground, you can go to Solid Ground Support at Substack. And have a wonderful week, everybody. We will look forward